Hello all, I'm Kel Kidman and welcome to Breaking on the Daily, where today the Cuomo scandal continues. You see, impeachment is now being offered, and that is what the New York legislature is now trying to do. This is really good, Cuomo's done a lot of really terrible things in terms of policy. I mean, his absolutely horrendous grandma killing policy, it would be an appropriate term for it, has done major damage, has killed literally thousands of people. And that sort of thing is really, really bad. And so it's really good to see this sort of action coming out of New York. And that's not all, because they're also doing a federal investigation, or they're doing a statewide investigation, with a ex-federal investigator. Got those two mixed up for a second there. This is really good, It's so great. I really am glad to see that New York is going to keep Cuomo on, keep him accountable for his actions. Oh, wait. That's not what this is about, is it? Because it turns out that it's not actually about the actual thing that he should be fired over and that he should be removed over, but instead it's about sexual harassment claims. Woohoo! Oh yes, that seems so much fun. This story keeps updating, and it's so frustrating to see not only the left-wing media, but the right-wing media as well continue to fall for this completely obvious trap. This is nonsense. It is trying to hide, as I've already explained in the past, what the Democrats did. I explained this yesterday, and I'm not going to go through it again, but that's what it's doing. They're trying to hide their bad policy because they don't want it to cascade onto all the other governors who are doing similarly terrible things, particularly Michigan, though other states were doing not things quite as bad, but certainly they were not great. That is what has been happening over the past few weeks. But all of it is being ignored. And it really frustrates me to this core, because honestly, this story, the sexual harassment stuff, it's like, oh yeah, I kind of care in some of the cases. Some of them are inane nonsense. Others are actual, assault charges and, legitimately creepy stuff. Some is just nothing. It's kind of a mixed bag, but to be honest, it kind of pales in comparison to the thousands of grandmas killed, as we've already established. That's way worse. So why is this getting talked about? Why does this story continue to exist? And by exist, of course, I mean, why does it keep showing up in my feed, and why do I have to talk about it every single day? Well, simple. It's a culture war thing. People are really interested in the double standard and the fact that Cuomo's not following his own rules. Well, I don't care all that much. All right? Yes, it is worth it to point out that he's a hypocrite on the Me Too stuff with regard to himself and also Biden. But it is also worth it to mention that this is not where our priority should be. Look, I know that hypocrisy is not only very important, but very easy to call out. But sometimes you have to call out things that are a bit more difficult and a bit more abstract to call out. Things like the actual scandal for Cuomo, the one that was happening back in April and May. Sometimes you have to do that because that's the more important thing. Priorities, guys. We need those priorities. This story really needs to stop existing. And anytime a right-wing publisher is publishing about this story, I want to see them immediately double back and go right back to the grandma killing stuff, because that's more important. But all of these actions that are being done by the New York state government and a bunch of people in New York who want to take his job, which is certainly what the AG wants to do, and likely some in the legislature as well, that sort of stuff, it's all distraction. It's all distraction, because until they're doing it for the thing that actually matters to everyday, normal New York citizens, they're not doing anything worthwhile. They are only doing this to save their own political skins. They're only doing this because they know they were still defending Cuomo on this particular policy back in May, when everyone was already talking about it. That's why they're doing it. This should not be surprising. But speaking of COVID, we are also on the road to seeing COVID end, because there have been a lot of rollbacks of policy, and today we're actually beginning with something from the CDC, a place that I talked about just yesterday with regard to the mask stuff and how they decimated their own mask narrative in any meaningful way. what they have done now is they are now kind of pulling back on the narrative of even if you're vaccinated, you still have to keep on the mask. Now they are removing their guidelines saying that you have to still wear a mask even if you're vaccinated. And this coincides as well with around the same time where America has now passed the number of people who are fully vaccinated and who are as compared to people who have actually gotten COVID. This is a good thing. Look, I have made it myself clear that I'm not going to get the vaccine, and this is in large part because I am not at risk for COVID-19. I am a healthy person. I'm not particularly overweight or anything like that. I'm kind of in shape. Not really, but I'm working on that. I do work out every day. I'm not old or anything like that. I'm totally fine, not even 20 yet. All of these sorts of things I'm totally fine on, so I'm not going to get a vaccine. And I'm particularly not going to get a vaccine because it's in support of authoritarian policies, and this is kind of an example of such. Though, I would argue, not fully, because I think this is only a first step, because as we are seeing more and more Republican states roll back entirely on their COVID restrictions, Wyoming being the most recent one actually, there has been this sort of momentum building. And this momentum will continue to build over the next few months, to the point where I imagine many blue states will end up completely opening up their doors and removing the mask mandates themselves, because that's where all of this momentum is going. Vaccines, as I've already stated, have outpaced the number of COVID recipients, people who've actually got COVID. This is an important metric because it means that as we go on and as we go forward, we're doing a whole lot more still, and we're continuing to even rise in the number of vaccinations that are being done every day. And as we get closer to the 100 million mark, we're going to have a substantial amount of herd immunity, with many people not being able to pass it to other people. And even if you're not vaccinated, it doesn't really matter, because people who are vaccinated are, and that would end up being the majority of the population in the long run. I'm under no illusions that it won't be. As that goes on, there's going to be a whole lot more people who are simply not going to get it, even if you, someone who isn't vaccinated, does end up getting it. It's going to become much less of a problem, and the justification of actually having COVID policy is going to slowly go away. And so I'm not as scared as other people with regard to things like the Great Reset. I think they'll continue to push it, even after COVID goes away from the news cycle and stops really being a huge part of our lives. Though, without COVID being a huge part of our lives, and considering the fact that they have not gotten in a whole lot of policy that they really need, they're not going to succeed on a whole lot of stuff. As I've stated before, I think the 2020 election, if anything, in terms of what it was for the Democrats, was simply a stopgap against the political pendulum swinging towards the right. It does not seem to me that it was actually a case of this pendulum beginning to swing back towards the left. I base this belief on the fact that many elections, down-ballot elections, were won by the right rather than the left. And the only major election that was really won by the left was up at the Fed, particularly with the presidency and 3 Senate seats. That's about it. In terms of everything else, well, the Democrats kind of lost out, and that's only going to become worse going into 2022 and 2024, with many right-wing movements, I imagine, springing up all over the country. This is what I think this all leads to. A fundamentally shift towards the right, and a more permanent one, because people misunderstand and believe that the swamp can be drained in 4 years. That's not true. It can't even be drained in 8. That's not how this sort of thing works. It is so entrenched. It is something that has existed for so long, you can't possibly expect that 4 years or even 8 years would be a sufficient enough amount of time to fully drain it. Throughout the 4 years of Trump's presidency, he was being directly lied to by people who he was over, and he couldn't deal with them. Do I blame that at least partially on Trump with regard to his hiring practices and the faults of such? Yes, I do. But I can't blame it all on the guy, considering that he was trying to deal with getting rid of most of the government in its entirety. And almost no one liked him, to be sure. Many people were very frustrated with how he ran things. This is a very well-known thing. It's not surprising, then, that when they find the chance, when they find something that they don't think he'll catch them out on, at least not until after he gets out, they'll start lying to him about particular things. One of which happened to be the number of troops in Syria and Afghanistan. They were lying about that sort of stuff, and Trump wasn't realizing it. I don't think that had anything to do with Trump necessarily. I think that had to do with the fact that the swamp is just so entrenched, nothing got to him with regard to that lie. You know, and we've kind of gotten off into the weeds, but moving on to something that I found very funny. Burger King was almost based. Almost. They almost got there. They gave a tweet saying women belong in the kitchen. And man, that is a really, really funny tweet. I can't express enough how much I love that tweet. Because here's the thing. It's not just that, oh, traditional gender roles or anything like that. No. This is a fun bit of irony because, Burger King is actually a food restaurant. And so there are presumably women in their kitchen. And so they're saying women belong in our kitchen, having a job, getting paid, and that sort of stuff. So it's kind of actually more of a second-wave feminist tweet rather than, something like a TradCon tweet or something like that. But this caused an absolute mess of a time on Twitter, with many people getting extremely angry, predictably, and wailing about as though they had nothing to do. Because they don't. These people on Twitter don't generally have anything in their lives to accomplish or, try at. Most of them are communists, after all, so it's not like they have any sort of drive towards self-determination or self-improvement or anything like that. It's not exactly surprising that many people were not exactly thrilled about this tweet. And Burger King sadly took it down and then walked it back and were saying, groveling apologies all around and that sort of thing. But, and the reason I brought this up today is because I have a sneaking suspicion that more things like this are in all likelihood going to happen in the future, because I feel as though, and this is kind of a tentative feeling, it's not something I'm making a definitive prediction on or anything like that, but if some of the things I'm already starting to see start going in the direction I'm potentially expecting, I expect that more of these sorts of stories will come out, and that more people in these sort of corporate places will end up turning out as right-wing. That I have a feeling that many people on the right, normal people on the right, are fed up with cancel culture. And you can look at a few things. You can look at the resale rates of Dr. Seuss books on eBay. You could look at all these sorts of things that are happening. And it's kind of a new phenomenon, and I'm kind of getting out ahead of it. I don't even know if it will really end up being a thing. But I have a feeling that the cultural trends of whatever is corporate America will kind of start reversing themselves as people on the right start taking up more of a financial position in terms of what companies they're going to support. Another example of this I see is sort of the get woke, go broke. There have been many instances of that happening, though I think the most important one in terms of the burgeoning pattern that I'm seeing would actually be the NFL, where the NFL get woke and lost a lot of their viewership, despite being in COVID time, which would presumably actually raise their numbers and would incentivize people to watch them because they don't have a whole lot more to do. And that happened with many a sports league, and certainly places like ESPN and the like that were putting political talk shows essentially in terms of where there should be only sports. That's what I think is kind of maybe happening. Once again, I'm not making a full prediction on this sort of thing, but I will say I do want that sort of thing to happen. I do want to see more of a pushback against corporate America from the right and actually see these sorts of trends be reversed. I do want to see that, because many corporations are kind of blind to this sort of stuff. I mean, they talk about it, they make a lot of overtures to the wokeness, but I don't think that a lot of them really believe it. And once you start getting in and start making some moves that are at least somewhat similar to the left, another example of this would be lawfare. Lawfare is something that really didn't exist on the right until 15 or so years ago, and now it's becoming more of a thing. more and more, the right is taking up certain tactics of the left, tactics that are, while undesirable, certainly aren't necessarily immoral, and they're using them more and more and more effectively. And I'm kind of excited to see where that goes. And if it goes anywhere at all, frankly. But let's leave it off on a more happy note, because our last story is actually about the Georgia Senate, where the Georgia Senate has actually passed a bill stopping no excuse absentee voting. This is a good first step, and, immediately after I saw this happening, I wanted to go and see what the leftists were going to react to this sort of bill. It's kind of the normal voter ID sort of fare. We're talking about voter integrity, and it's great. I like it a lot. This is a good bill. But I wanted to see what the left was thinking about it. And so I went to theguardian.com, where I saw them complaining about it. And it was actually kind of interesting to see what particularly they were complaining about. Because almost immediately in this article, they pivot from talking about the Georgia bill and how much they hate it because, voter suppression, to immediately talking about H.R. 1, which does make a bit of sense, though it wasn't something I necessarily expected. You see, The Guardian, as you would expect from a sort of place that platforms communists and other more central government-believing in figures, they are pro the federalization of elections, and that is what H.R. 1 is designed to do. But what they were particularly talking about with regard to H.R. 1 was actually how difficult it would be to pass, where they were talking about how the Democrats in the Senate need to find a way around the filibuster. And to be clear, the only way they could do that is, in all likelihood, by nuking it entirely. And that would be a bad idea, especially since they're probably not going to keep the Senate for all too long. I don't think it's a good idea. It's just not going to end well. Certainly, it's not going to end well. I mean, they could do it and then hope that they become a one-party dictatorship for the rest of time, which, if they get this sort of thing in and it has the effect that they want it to do, and it doesn't get struck down in court immediately, then yeah, they probably would be. But I don't even know if this bill is worth it, because as I just mentioned, it's probably going to get struck down immediately in court, because this reveals the actual flaw with H.R. 1. The flaw of H.R. 1 is that it is in all likelihood unconstitutional. Many things in that bill dictate how the states will do elections. The problem with that is that the states are the ones who determine how they run their elections. Now, the U.S. federal government can affect certain aspects of a federal election, something like a presidency, and that's pretty much it. They can affect mostly when it happens. They can affect what day actually is the actual day you elect people. I mean, they have to do it through a constitutional amendment, but they could do it. And the only other way they could affect it is actually through an amendment, similarly, where they'd have to actually amend the Constitution to say, no, federal elections are done by the federal government. They can't do this sort of stuff. It simply can't. There's no way to read into the Constitution the powers of the federal Congress to actually affect federal elections on such a deep level. There's just no way to do it. And I don't think that this sort of thing is going to exist for any amount of time in the actual court system. It's going to utterly implode on itself. So I don't think it's really worth it to pass this bill. Of course, the leftists don't understand that because they have no meaning to the word of pragmatism. They have no concept of it. And so it's not exactly surprising that they would not understand that this sort of bill would only destroy the sort of political capital that Biden maybe sort of really doesn't have. I mean, Biden has almost no political capital, as I've covered on many an occasion. And this sort of bill, being passed in its entirety, isn't going to end well. And in all likelihood, I don't even think they have 50 votes. I don't think they have Joe Manchin on this. They might. I mean, they will see. Certainly. But I don't think they have it. I really don't. But to move back to what Georgia was doing, this is a good step. as opposed to, say, Arizona, going after investigations, trying to figure out exactly what happened. I feel as though, at this point particularly, legislation is what people should be focused on. Because here's the thing. If you get bogged down in investigations, when you already really know what the problem is, that being mail-in ballots and the lack of signature verification and the openings for the executive or judicial branches of government to interfere in an election, when you already know those are the issues of election integrity, when you already know not only that, but also how to solve it, why are you going through the trouble of investigating it when the investigation, it might cause an optics win, it might make your position look better, but you already know what you're doing. Most of the country already kind of agrees with you, and so I don't see why they're even wasting their time on this. I want to see the state houses, the 30 state houses the Republicans have, all passing similar bills to this Georgia bill, perhaps even more. Because once you get that through, once you get that done, you don't have to worry about anything happening in the future, which is what you're really worried about at this point. Because Biden's already been inaugurated. He's not going to become uninaugurated under any circumstances, at least not until 4 years later. And, unless under the most extreme circumstances that would only exist in a CNN fever dream. You're not going to be seeing him getting uninaugurated. You're not going to see anything like that. All right? It's simply not going to happen. So you need to look to the future. You can't continue to live on in the past. Because if you live on in the past, and your eyes are on the ground or behind you, what are you going to do except you're going to run into whatever the next problem is, and then you're not going to be able to solve it. That's what's going to happen. It's similar, I would say, to how certain times when people, say, have an accident on the freeway, sometimes it causes a collision. And I'm not talking immediately, but when people are kind of driving past. Because people are drawn to that collision over there. And when they're drawn to that collision over there, sometimes they get so distracted that they end up colliding themselves with other things. This sort of thing is really, you need to be careful about this. Because you can run into the exact same problem again if you don't solve it. And the only way you're going to solve it is through passing legislation. And this particular bill is a good way of doing that. All right? Because the sort of screwy stuff that was happening in Georgia's elections doesn't happen without mail-in ballots. It just doesn't. Because even if you say they have the 4 a.m. ballot dumps, those aren't going to happen because the ballots aren't there. Because they cannot justify bringing in 40,000 ballots that come from who knows where. Because there's not 40,000 mail-in ballots in the entire state at that point. They can't just have no excuse mail-in ballots. Once that's done, well, there's no ballots in the trucks that are coming in at 4 a.m. Who cares? Suddenly becomes much less of an issue and much more manageable. And that's really good. And that is a really good place to leave us off, actually. And wherever you are, if you made it to the end of this video, do, in fact, subscribe. We have many pretty links down below, also for you YouTube plebs who should go literally anywhere else, please. This site is awful. Stop using it. Just stop using it. Yeah. Well, I'm Kel Kidman. This has been Breaking on the Daily, and I'm out.